Ko Matariki ki te rangi, ko Tamariki Ora ki te whenua, nō reira e ngā iho o ngā maunga whakahi, e awhi ana i ngā māhuri o te wao ruia. Ruia ki te waiora, kia pua wai ai a tātou kākano. Kia ora koutou and welcome to Tamariki Ora, a new beginning. I'm Carol Hirschfeld and tonight we're taking an unflinching look at child abuse and domestic violence in Aotearoa. The month of Matariki is traditionally a time to focus on change, a time when one chapter closes and another begins. Tonight we have the opportunity to open a new chapter. It's a subject you may not want to talk about, a topic you may not want to address, but it's vital that we as a nation confront the issue head on. That New Zealand has the fourth worst child murder rate in the OECD is a national shame, and that must be addressed. On average, 10 children are killed by a member of their family every year. Over the next two nights, we'll discuss what is being done to prevent the maltreatment of our children and look at some of the solutions on offer. We'll hear from the abused and the abusers, as well as looking into some of the many programs available to struggling parents. We'll hear stories that dismay, but also stories of hope. As part of tonight's special broadcast, we'll be talking to some of New Zealand's most prominent musicians who've composed songs dedicated to the children of Aotearoa. Join us later for Sounds of Hope. But first, over the next hour, we examine how exposure to violence changes a child's brain development. We'll take you behind the scenes of the Hospital Child Crisis Team and meet a South Auckland kuia who stepped in for the sake of her mokopuna. Breaking the cycle of abuse can be a slow and painful process, but it's not impossible. Our first item focuses on the journey of one woman who's managed to do just that.
There were very few photos taken of me because I was considered to be too ugly. Mum maintained that I looked like I'd been hit in the face with a shovel. And I believed that right up until my late 40s, and I actually found out that I just looked like everybody else.
Pat lives with her granddaughter, Michaela. Michaela's world is full of all the love and support Pat never had growing up.
My grandmother was abused, and she was more or less forced to give a baby away. That broke her heart. I don't believe she ever recovered from it. She had my mother. My grandmother was totally emotionally detached from her all her life. And you have different types of abuse. So for my mother, she was horrifically abused by my father. He never laid a hand on her, but he abused her emotionally, financially. So many people think that abuse is only if you're getting hit, but the other forms of abuse are just as debilitating and just as harmful and do just as much damage. It's just that bruises show, and the other parts hurt, breaks you inside.
What about the grandma's stuff?
Oh yeah, we need the grandma's stuff. Mum had very little support, and basically I don't think she had the skills to be a good mother. I was terrified of Mum, absolutely terrified of the woman. I've got a scar on my nose and across my cheek where apparently, I don't remember, but I was so naughty when I was 3, she couldn't manage me and she threw me out the back door on concrete stairs. She would just grab me by the hair and bounce me off the walls quite often, and this has also stayed with me for all my life, for the look on my face. Whatever she had in her hands, whatever she was doing, she would just attack us and beat us. I never learnt at school. School was a very hard place for me. I was so afraid of what was going to happen when I got home from school that it just preoccupied my mind the whole time. I ran away from home when I was 15. I lived with a much older man. I had 4 children by the time I was 22, which was just way too many too soon. I really loved having my babies. I would have said, yeah, I was a really good mum. And the reality is I abused my children just as much as my mother abused her children in a different way. That's the truth.
The first 10 years I grew up in Auckland, have no ill memories until Mum moving to Tamariki. She started seeing her third husband. Pretty much once that happened, we were just treated like prospects. you can't argue with the man. Like this man, you know, I'm 6 foot and 100 kgs. He would have dwarfed me. You know, this man was a big man.
Things got really ugly then. I married a patch member of a gang. Then the kids became exposed to guns and drug deals and violence. He used to beat me. He was a huge man. He had what they called a king punch. He could knock me out one blow. Somewhere along the line after my 5th son was born, I started taking drugs. They grew up thinking drugs was just absolutely normal. Violence was absolutely normal. I had very violent marriages. I've been knocked out so many times, my head still hurts.
It was a bit psychological as well as physical, because you could get a hiding for anything. I remember if they ever went away, that we'd have to spotlessly clean the house and walk around on eggshells just to be sure that we weren't going to get a hiding. We'd get hidings from frying pans, from you name it. I felt resentful towards her, but I didn't feel it was in her control. And I knew it wasn't in her control because I knew how the house operated, or how it operated around her husband, you know, so.
If someone had to come and tap me on the shoulder back then in the day and said, hey, you really need to leave, I would have thought they were joking. When you're in that situation and you are being battered and you are abused and you are now being abusive, leaving isn't an option. You don't think of leaving. There is always that hope that things are going to get better. I was very ashamed for a lot of years and very, 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 very sorry. I was deeply ashamed.
Pat finally left her husband and took out a protection order against him.
I was sent a letter through the courts from Hamilton saying I could attend these classes. And at the time I thought, well, how stupid, you know, I've left the relationship, I don't need help. I don't know why I went back to the door and got the letter and then went to the organisation and enrolled into the classes. But it was the best thing that ever happened in my life, because up until that point I could tell you all the horrible things that had happened, and I thought it was all my fault. I went to these classes. I learned that, man, did I make lots of mistakes, but I also learned that I too had been a victim, which doesn't make it right, but it gives you an understanding.
Pat works for the Hamilton Abuse Intervention Project, which supports men, women and children who've been abused or been abusers in the past.
This is what they call the coalface. We're dealing with the real bottom line abuse and violence. This is a power control bill. Most of them, the kids that are coming here, are offenders. But you have to realise that as the cycle goes round and around and round, they were the victims first, and now they're offending. Domestic violence is when this is happening to you at home. One person who will do whatever it takes to get their own way and believes they have the right to do so, to either mums, children, or the people that they are deciding that they want to control. All abuse is no. I believe that I'm working in the job that I'm doing now, particularly with youth, because they could be my children. I will go all out to help them with whatever support they need. And if they've come from physically or abusive backgrounds, I know where they're coming from.
Pat has seen many stories of abuse like her own at the Hamilton Abuse Intervention Project. Every day, around 20 police family violence reports come through the centre.
I've never met a woman that consciously, deliberately wants to damage her children. If a child isn't nurtured and cared for in a loving way, they may make a conscious decision not to be like that, or they may just carry on the cycle and carry on the cycle. So when children aren't loved and nurtured, the effect it has on them is profound. Anthony got involved in drugs, which is not a surprise. At the moment he's on home detention for supplying methamphetamine as a dealer. He's been to jail for drugs. He's spent the last, I don't know, about 12 months just trying to be the nice young man he used to be before he turned into a monster. He'd been married, his marriage had broken up, and he had a little girl, Michaela.
Let's face it, all children want to do is be, he wants to be what dad is, and she wants to be what mum is, and they just want to be what the older people are doing. The people that I grew up admiring and aspiring to be were gangsters. Oh, brother, I was supposed to tell you something. It couldn't be very important. You all see.
He's an awesome father. His whole life actually revolves around Michaela. She loves him dearly. He'd never smack her. He doesn't even have to really growl at her.
Michaela has never seen violence or drugs. Everybody who comes to this house knows that it's a family house. As you can see, half my bedroom is half of her bedroom. So when she comes, you know, the kids programs go on. The rabbit comes out and it's kid time. She'll even paint my toenails. I don't care. You know, my mates come and tease the crap out of me. I don't care. I really don't, because it's about her at that stage and what she needs and what she's going to get.
If someone raised their voice at her, it would make her cry, because that doesn't happen in her world. I did look at her when she was 3, and I go back to the 2 scars on my face. I did look at her and think when she was 3, what could I possibly have done so bad to be thrown down concrete stairs?
Pat's transformation has changed her family, but change must happen on a wider scale. Statistics tell us in our country too many children are suffering. Child, Youth and Family received 49,063 reports of abuse that required further action in 2006. After the break, we look at some groundbreaking neuroscience that's being used to improve the lives of struggling caregivers.
It is pervasively bad for human beings to grow up in environments of threat, humiliation, and degradation.
Welcome back to Tamariki Ora, A New Beginning, an in-depth look at child maltreatment in New Zealand. According to police statistics, in 2008, almost 75,000 New Zealand children were present at recorded incidents of domestic violence, and these were just the reported cases. It's now known that this kind of exposure to violence can have an enormously harmful effect on brain development in children under 3. Babies severely neglected and deprived of stimulating experiences have been found to have brains 20 to 30% smaller than others their age. Our next story looks into the work of renowned clinician Dr. Bruce Perry, whose in-depth research into children's mental health and neuroscience has uncovered just how severe the effects are.
Texas is home to some groundbreaking research on the impact of violence and parental neglect on the development of a baby's brain. Dr. Bruce Perry has discovered the effect is profound in the first 3 years of a child's life and begins at conception.
You're born with billions and billions of neurons. And then after you're born, the process of becoming connected is really what takes place over the next year or so. So parts of the brain that get stimulated and networks that get stimulated maintained, and networks that don't get stimulation just go away, they resorb. So that process actually takes place very explosively in the first couple of years of life, so that by the time you're 3 or 4, your brain is physically about 90% adult size. And the major architecture that you use for all of the functional networks in your brain are in place.
Brain scans graphically show the impact violence has on brain development.
The much bigger spaces indicate underdevelopment of the cortex. This image captures parts of the brain that are involved in the reward system, parts of the brain involved in fine motor control, parts of the brain involved in speech and language and in planning and cognition, and in sort of modulating impulsivity. So all of those are impaired in this child. All of that's because they did not receive adequate caregiving early in life. This is looking at brain activity in comparison to normal controls. So all the gray areas, if this child had not had those experiences and had grown up in a consistent, predictable environment, his brain would just be gray. So every place you see a color or you see white, there's really abnormal functioning taking place. If you grow up in an environment of violence, it changes you. It changes the physiology that regulates your heart. It changes the physiology that regulates your lungs and your brain. So you have higher probabilities of heart disease, diabetes, asthma, mental health problems, social health problems, school problems. It is pervasively bad for human beings to grow up in environments of threat, humiliation, and degradation.
The influence of Bruce Perry's work in neuroscience has been felt around the world. In Greymouth, his ideas are used in the work of community parenting group, The Hub.
Neuroscience has the power, like nothing else I've ever seen, to move someone in an hour-and-a-half session. And I've been around a long time. And now we back the neuroscience into all our workshops. So every workshop, the downshifting, the anger change, all of that, it's backed in to the developing brain and what's happening in your brain.
We're not born ready for that environment. We're born and we spend 3 years gathering data. 3 years, filling in transcription genes. The baby gets to 3 and thinks most of the time I've felt like I've been alone. I better grow me a nice big healthy brainstem to look after myself. And you have to sacrifice some of the growth of the frontal cortex to do that. At the same time as saying the first 3 years matter, it's also never ever too late to improve someone's brain.
Based on the brainwave research, the Hub uses tools and intervention methods such as the repetition of positive behaviours to reverse damage in adult brains.
The trigger event happens and we shoot straight through. The brain has a pathway that says hit her or hurt something. I used to think do this and now I think, oh no, I've got a new way of doing things. That's right.
Yeah.
So I start to use the new pathway. The brain's so clever that it puts a chemical in here and it closes off the old pathway. This becomes a major highway. This becomes a dirt track. Except one day, we leave group, we don't come for 6 months, something happens, and we use the old pathway. This becomes a dirt track. That's why changing adult behaviour is so hard.
It's too easy just to fall into the old pathway, but when someone walks alongside you, when you see anyone that's changed, even when you get hard-as people that have been, in prison for years and been hard-as and they can still turn the whole thing around and change, normally that's the result of a relationship with someone.
Always, always, I believe. Always, always. It's about relationship and connection.
Trisha's relationship with Vic Tamariki played a part in him turning his life around. Now the domestic violence campaigner's a regular visitor to the Hub, where he runs workshops for men.
I do a presentation on my life's journey, getting bashed in my early days, and then getting married and having kids and taking that, which was the love that I thought was love, into my family. The neuroscience that Trish shared with me just blew me away. After only about 15 minutes, I was outside crying because I just realised what had happened to me, and then how I had really no control over what I did, because I just went back to those deep, dark places that were my caverns of comfort, and that was violence.
These guys growing up in these households, their brain really made memory that this is the way you solve problems. This is the way you handle women. Even though later on, that smart part of their brain said, when I get older, I'm never going to treat somebody this way because I know how it feels. When you get a little frustrated, the first thing that happens is these stress response systems shut off this smart part of your brain. And the primitive part of their brain that was raised in that abusive environment starts to tap into those memories about how I'm supposed to act. And then they end up doing these things. And then later on, when they're not so tuned up and anxious, they feel terribly guilty.
In order to make changes to their behaviour, Vic encourages the men in his groups to come to terms with their pasts.
all I'm going to do is ask you questions, and if the question is you stand up, and if not, you stay seated, yeah? If while you were growing up and you got beaten up by older people, mum, dad, uncle, auntie, nana, can you please stand? If during your years you were responsible either intentionally or accidentally for the death of a member of the public, can you please stand?
Thanks, guys. Thanks, bro.
Thanks, Jace.
I didn't want to admit it. And you know, there's something that I've been trying to block out for years.
Yeah. If you paid attention to when people were standing up, then you know that there's a lot of violence in the room. And that's what we're here to address. Thanks, guys.
Many, many, many healthy people and really good contributors to society have gone through these really challenging experiences. And, but they will tell you, even though they may be successful, even though they may have a decent job and good relationships, that there was a cost to that. And that getting to where they got in their life was harder than if they hadn't had all of that stuff.
Everything they say about the kids and that and their brains and stuff is, yeah, I really understand. Then I've realised how much damage I've caused to them just by all the stuff they've seen me do.
Seen heaps.
Seeing Daddy beat Mummy up just changed me a lot. My discipline in them, the way I approached them, and my way of loving them, really. I've got heaps of tools that I can use now, and Laura could use too. When I feel like I know he's getting to me, I'll just try and come down to his level and just talk to them.
You don't just want to smack them straight away, because you've got other ideas.
The first thing that Trish said was a baby just recognises a smile. And so that's all I've tried to do is just smile at the babies, and it bloody works. I don't know what it does for the baby, but all I know is that those babies now come looking for me, and it's sad to think that that's all I needed. That's all I needed that I didn't get, and I'm able to now do that for my grandchildren, break the curse of family violence, and use some of the tools and skills and the training that Trish gave me.
I think it's a recovering journey. I think that all your life you'll be working on, because it's a rewiring of the brain, it's a new pathways, and as adults it's so much harder to do. So I think that it's how Alcoholics Anonymous, narcotic, all those 12-step programs work on a continual place for meetings in the 12-step program. So I think it's about a lifetime's work. A lot of our whānau can't meet their children's needs. Their own needs have never been met. So how on earth can they do that? So you're modelling that. Whether it's the response, I don't know. It's our response, and it's certainly working.
If you adhere to traditional child-rearing practices, early childhood practices, and traditional practices around sleep, caregiving, community living, you have a much higher probability of being physically and emotionally healthy.
See, I believe child abuse, family violence stops home by home, street by street. If we can do it in little old Greymouth, they can do it anywhere. Communities have to come up from underneath and say, we no longer tolerate this. How are we going to change it? And they say you couldn't do that in a city. The reason it's working for you, Trish Hunt, is because you're in Greymouth. Bullshit. You do it street by street.
All over the country, there are people like Trish and Vic working to change the lives of caregivers who are struggling as parents. Facing our pasts and making changes is never easy, but those who do are heroes. After the break, we meet another real-life hero, a South Auckland kuia who was not prepared to sit by and let her whānau suffer.
The parents of the children had the second highest call-out for domestic violence in South Auckland.
children need heroes, people who'll speak out for them when they have no voice, individuals unafraid to intervene, even when the cost is high. The kuia in our next story wasn't afraid to step in when she could see her mokopuna needed her.
My son was not fit to be the father, their dad. He's got issues. He needs to deal with his issues.
When Denise realised the level of abuse her grandchildren were being subjected to by her son, she and her husband took action.